I'm Isabella and you're listening to Xeno. Each month I have conversations with people from all walks of life about their personal stories of home, identity and the search for belonging. Aniefiok Ekpoudom, welcome to the show. It's wonderful to have you here. I'm so grateful to be able to delve into your book, Where We Come From, Rap, Home and Hope in Modern Britain. How do you describe yourself and what you do?
Thank you for having me, first of all. How do I describe myself? I'm a writer from South London, and that's been the bulk of my public-facing work has been defined by writing, and whether that's journalism or now writing a book, being an author. And then within that, my work tends to capture the climate of the country through documenting its cultural outputs like music or football and sports, and using these cultural tenets to really explore ideas of community, home and place and belonging, and how people are existing in the country today, essentially, is how I describe my work. And then outside of that, I'm just a 31-year-old guy, football fan, all of these other things too.
Beautiful. I absolutely love this book, and I really encourage everybody listening to buy a copy of it at their local independent bookstore. And this is exactly as you said, you're archiving such an important social history in the UK. And what you did so beautifully in the book as well, just this musicality to your writing and the sense of rhythm, which is perfectly in line with the stories that you're trying to bring to the forefront. And I'd love to start off with a reading.
Chapter 1, Babylon. This is how they arrived here. There are stories about the Britain that existed in the imaginations of those early West Indian settlers arriving through the 40s, 50s and 60s. Fantasies held close by young men and women setting out for the supposed promised land of milk and honey, where the roads were rumoured to be paved with gold. But the reality of this place was different than they had imagined. The West Midlands was grey with bitter winters that stripped leaves from the trees, where the skies screamed hail and rain through the long cold evenings. There were factories unfurling black smoke for as far as the eye could see, and there was isolation, a loneliness among solo travellers who had left family and friends behind. There were men and women taking brave steps into a cold new world, building new lives in a land so different to back home, pouring themselves into a country that would, at times, resent their presence. Some struggled to find housing, some struggled to find work. Some noticed hostility in a region and a wider population angered by and ignorant about its growing black communities. For these early settlers to survive Babylon, they would have to walk through the fire. This is how they arrived here. The line from the Caribbean to the West Midlands, from Jamaica and Trinidad and St. Kitts and other islands, to Birmingham and Coventry and Walsall and Wolverhampton, has its beginnings in the ashes of war. In the 1940s, when the Second World War had finished and Europe sank back into a tense peace, Britain began a slow emergence from the wreckage. Soldiers returned home, the elderly resumed retirement after taking up vacant civil responsibilities to help with the war effort. Housing developments were planned in bombed-out towns and cities, slums were cleared, and a National Health Service was announced. The war had worn on the economy and the workforce, and a country needing to rebuild itself couldn't do so alone. So, in 1948, 3 years after the war had ended, the British Nationality Act was introduced. Residents of British colonial territories and independent Commonwealth countries were recognised as British subjects and were, in theory, granted the right to settle in the UK, free to find work and housing, to vote and raise families. In the aftermath of the Act, a steady wave of West Indian immigrants arrived. They came to be known as the Windrush generation, named after the HMT Empire Windrush, which docked at Tilbury in 1948, carrying 1,027 passengers turned British citizens on its voyage from Jamaica. By 1970, more than 500,000 immigrants from the Caribbean had arrived here. They settled in places like Newport in Wales, Notting Hill and Clapham in London. They slowly fanned out across the West Midlands too: Birmingham, Wolverhampton, Walsall, Coventry, West Bromwich, and so on, erecting the early stems of large black communities in these towns and cities across the region. The settlers were the forefathers and foremothers of a UK rap and grime generation, Caribbean people moving across North Atlantic waters, laying down their roots in new homes, readying the soil for a generation of British children to emerge. This is how they arrived here. These families often came to the West Midlands in staggers. A husband first, then a wife, and the children. They first worked as bus drivers and as nurses, as factory and construction workers, a growing black enclave in the heart of the country, building Britain up from the rubble. Their early experiences in a foreign West Midlands are collated in Birmingham Museum Trust's Black Oral History Project, where the lives and memories of the city's first generation of Caribbean immigrants were orally recorded and set permanently into stone. In these accounts, their growing presence encounters early aggression, racism ranging from the subtle to the overt. Frank Scantlebury, who moved to the UK from Barbados in 1955, told the project, "Very early on after we arrived, we didn't notice any racism, but after a while, after we settled in, we realised that some people were rather hostile to us. We found it very strange. We never expected to encounter that sort of thing. We were always taught that it was a fair society." Another recording comes from Esme Lancaster, who arrived from Jamaica in 1950, joining her sister who had settled in the country years prior. Esme's early memories of Birmingham and Britain are of a deep winter moving over the city and a homesickness that lasted for months, reducing her to long spells of tears. She fell into the church to find comfort. She found a job doing office admins on the weekends, and in doing so, brushed up against a white community hostile to her people. Racism at work was whispered, communicated in gestures unspoken, hinted in low tones behind closed doors. Sometimes, Esme's boss would bring her the work unfinished and set aside by white colleagues. They had spent the afternoon slacking off, their leftovers now hers to complete. One afternoon, while in the cloakroom, she overheard colleagues tell one another how they couldn't stand the sight of her. In response, she told them, "I am here. We are here. We are coming, and we're increasing. One day we will be like the children of Israel in the land of Egypt, and if you don't like it, you can go or die." Then she walked away. This is how they arrived here.
There were so many themes in reading the book, and what really struck me was this strong sense of resilience and connection, ambition, and heritage and adaptability against the odds. And you chart these really powerful stories of people like Cecil Morris, who started the pirate radio station, and the fact that it was shut down like over 1,500 times. The unbelievable resilience of people who knew how valuable this work was and how important it was for the community. And I'd love to ask you, why is it important for us to acknowledge, archive and contextualize the family tree of rap music in Britain?
Yeah, I think for me that was really important because the music is more popular than it's ever been commercially, definitely, and I guess culturally it's popular all across the country. We see UK rap headlining Glastonbury, we see it on the cover of magazines, we see it at the top of charts, at the top of streaming services. And I really wanted to try and explore what was the personal legacy inside the communities that had created the music, but to also show that this wasn't something that just happened by accident or a coincidence that this music suddenly exploded out from these places into wider public consciousness. It was something that had been going on in these spaces and in these communities for decades and decades and decades since the arrival of people who came in the Windrush generation and whatnot. And that although UK rap, when we think of it, may not have a history as long as that stretches back to the 40s and 50s, the culture of it does extend back to those periods. And I really wanted to show that connected history. And I think more so than that, I wanted to give show the personal accounts of history as opposed to, I wanted to show the humanity in the history and show the personal lives that have told away either quietly or loudly to make an impact in these spaces and who have contributed to this now flourishing and thriving music scene. I was really interested in uncovering those stories of resilience and the sacrifices that were made along the music's journey and the sacrifices that are still being made in that way too.
Yeah, and you really felt that in your writing, this sense that so many people were a part of this movement, and they were sowing seeds that they might not see the fruits of, which was so powerful to hear their stories.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's an artist called Getz who I didn't actually write about in the book because he's from East London, but and I focused on South London. But I remember him saying in an interview once that I think I was interviewing him, and he was saying that he knew that he was a grime MC and came of age in the early 2000s making music. But he said he knew when he looked at the landscape of the music scene, he knew that it wasn't going to be his generation that inherited the fruits of what was going on now. He said when he looks at America and how long it took for the music to take off and become something that people could sustain their lives off of, it took 2 or 3 generations. And he's looked at where the UK music scene was at and realised it's not going to be my generation that reap the rewards for this. It's going to be maybe 2 generations on from now. But still, he still persisted, keeping making music because he knew how important it was to lay that groundwork and to build some of those foundations so that those coming after can inherit something and can then have something to pass over to the next generation too.
And it was so beautiful how you threaded some of those stories like throughout the book. And I believe that you focus on Despa and this sense of these artists were coming into a space where there was no infrastructure. They built that infrastructure themselves, and you saw the conclusion where finally the infrastructure is there and it's ready to receive a new generation of artists. And I loved how both deeply hyper-local and national the book was. You focus on Wales, the West Midlands and South London in these stories. And I wonder, it seems like you formed such beautiful connections with the communities there. In researching and writing the book and connecting with these communities over such a long period of time, what has stayed with you from those interactions with people?
Yeah, I think that has been the most personally impactful part of the process, was getting to go out into the country and meet all of these different people and learn about all of these different communities. And because it took about 5 years, it was about 5 years of doing that over and over again, and going to Wales, going to the West Midlands. I live in South London, so that was a bit different, but in general, going out and meeting people over a sustained period of time and really getting to see the country in a way that I hadn't seen it before. I think one thing that definitely came through, and that I think that noticed I was changed by at the end, was just having a greater degree of empathy for people who I met so many people whose lives, circumstances from the very beginning of their lives were so different to mine, were so different to all of the other people who I'd met along the way too. And you hear all of these really unique stories, and it does give you a radical sense of empathy for how people are able to find meaning and purpose and connection in their lives despite the odds being really stacked against them at the beginning of their lives. And you talk about somebody desperate in the book who has quite a traumatic childhood in a lot of ways, and a lot of bereavement in his family early on, from direct siblings to parents to grandparents, and still manages to find his own sense of family at the end of it. I definitely left with a greater sense of empathy. And then also, even in a sense of, I was going to places that were so unlike where I'd lived or where I'd been to before. When I went to the South Wales Valleys, for example, and these are 95% white working class Welsh towns and places I'd never been to before, and you hear people's ideas or frustrations, and you start to empathize and you start to understand in a way that maybe I wouldn't have been able to if I'd just received these things through social media or through a tweet or whatever. But actually getting to go and see these places and understanding why people feel how they feel definitely opened my eyes in a lot of ways, and I think has just made me a lot less quicker to judge when I hear something, even if it's something that I disagree with or wouldn't believe or act on in a certain way. A lot less quick to judge about it instead, and try and reach for a degree of understanding when it comes to those things. So that process of making those connections and hearing so many of these personal stories, I think definitely impacted me in that way.
Yeah, and in the book, there is this real sense that you're weaving together these intergenerational stories and how that created the scene that we see today. And I wonder what personal question was answered for you in writing this book, if you had one.
That's interesting. I'm not sure I had a personal question, but I had a curiosity, I would say. I had a real desire to go out and collect a lot of these stories, and had a real desire to write about people's lives in a way that I don't think they necessarily get written about, especially when we're thinking about Black British communities and working class communities in Britain. I don't think that level of study of human life has necessarily been afforded to these places. And when I was looking at America, and a lot of my favorite narrative nonfiction and creative nonfiction in America really does that. And you see writers make a real investment into the lives of other people to write about them with such care and detail and honesty. And I really wanted to bring that to the music that I love, the communities that I'm from. And that sense of curiosity and urgency is what probably led me more so than a question, I would say. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's so interesting that you bring up the tender language that we often take for granted and how important it is to write these stories with empathy and inclusion in mind. And some of the lyrics that you included in the book as well tell deeply personal stories. And I think you've spoken in previous interviews around like the mental health impacts of what people went through and how music gave them a space to speak honestly about these things. How has your sense of connection to people changed through writing the book?
One thing I didn't realise the book is how much of a space it is for connection in that way. And I think even it's only been out for maybe 4 months now, 5 months. And the amount of connections I've been able to make just off the back of the book being out has been amazing in itself. Like getting to travel with the book has been such a big thing. So I've got to go to so many different parts of the country again. And then because there is such a national focus on it, I feel like I've been able to then really understand other places too. And people come with a keenness to tell me about the places that they're from, even if those places aren't in the book, which has been that's been a really beautiful part of the process, I would say. And I think also it just opens up space for conversation where a lot of the stories are really personal and people are really vulnerable in there. I think it creates a degree of vulnerability when I'm then speaking about the book with somebody else, or I'm speaking with family members or friends and we're reflecting on it. I think it creates I've noticed to start to create a space for vulnerability with just other connections and relationships in my life, which has been something that's happened with some of my other writing before and it's happening with this book as well. And I think that's been such a blessing in that way.
Yeah, it seems the approach that you've taken with writing the book has been very community focused, like spending years getting to understand these communities and how the scenes emerged and what the history was behind those different scenes. And you spoke of this curiosity that you had going into the writing process, but it's also rooted in your passion for music and how much you love the scene itself.
Yeah.
I would love to know, when people ask you the question, where are you from? What answer do you give and what truths are missing from that answer?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. I think when people ask me where I'm from, I tend to say Bromley in South London. But then that also then depends where, if I'm talking to somebody from, especially when I was travelling and I'm speaking to somebody from Coventry, I'd probably just say London. If I'm speaking to someone in London, I'd say Bromley. If I'm speaking to someone from Bromley, it breaks down even more locally than that. But then I think if I'm speaking to somebody from maybe a friend, or the question may be phrased in a way where we're talking about nationality and heritage, and my answer will skip straight to my own heritage and background, Nigeria and Cameroon and those kind of things. So I feel like in the whichever answer I give, there's always a side of it that isn't necessarily expressed, because there are so many dualities to that sense of where I feel like I'm from and where I belong to. And I think Black British identity is a really big part of that too, and that's something I've definitely come to identify with more and more as the years have passed, and that carries its own specific details as well. And if I'm speaking to somebody else who's Black and from this country, there are certain things we may just skip over and just talk about heritage instead, because there is that already understanding of those migration paths that brought us here. So yeah, it's such a multi-layered question which I never have one direct answer to.
And the book is such an inclusive and expansive social history that you're charting through the music in these different regions. And I wonder, how have you re-envisioned a sense of belonging when you look at Black British culture through music, through writing the book?
Yeah, something with the book I was really interested in exploring was the idea of land and geography of a place. And I think that's quite present throughout a lot of the chapters. Is as much as I'm talking about the personal stories, I'm really focused on talking about the land that the music and these people inhabit and have inhabited for generations. And especially when it comes to Black British identity, I think that was something I was really interested in exploring, because you have places like South London, Coventry, Birmingham, even in South Wales, where you have generations of families who have been on the same land now for maybe 60, 70, or in some cases 100 years. And I was really interested in exploring what does that relationship look like and what does that sense of connection mean in a place that, although it may not be your quote unquote ancestral land, there's still enough time has passed that there is that sense of connection to it. And how has that land formed and shaped you as a person, and how has it formed and shaped Black British communities across the country? So that sense of home and belonging, I really was keen to bring through that idea of inhabiting a space for a prolonged period of time, and a generational period of time too. And what does that say about how we feel about ourselves in the space that we inhabit? Yeah.
Your writing is so lyrical, and and also I have to say I listened to the audiobook as well as the book, and as well as reading the book. And yeah, really the way you read the book is so beautiful. And yeah, you really get a sense of that. The landscape kind of erupts out of the text, and you could see the diversity of these different spaces that these communities are living in. And it seems like from beginning to the end of the book, there's this kind of constant balance between adversity and hope. And I wonder, how do you think about hope, or what makes you feel most hopeful researching for this book and writing it?
Interesting. What makes me feel most hopeful? I would say that just seeing how music and legacy continues in ways, even if that's out of the shadows. And I think seeing that, I think, was really powerful and really special. But also seeing how, with a lot of the stories in the book, not all of them end with people becoming huge mainstream musicians and selling loads of records. Some of them stop music, some of them quit music, some of them have less high profile careers, but then seeing how music had changed their lives in other ways and had given them either memories or connections or family or a sense of purpose in that way was really beautiful to see, because it made me realize that despite whatever commercial and career ambitions we all hold in our lives, the really important things that happen when you get to the end of your life and you think about what does it mean to have lived a purposeful and good life in terms of community, connection with other people, and really enjoying the time that you had here. Music was really given that, and rap was really given that to so many people across the country. And I think that gives me a sense of hope that despite whatever turn the music takes commercially, it might go on a downturn next, who knows, that sense of those intangible things are never going to be missing, because there is a power in music that extends beyond money and monetary gain, essentially. And I think those things and those tenets will always be there.
And the real truth of why people started making the music from your writing, it's some people were motivated by money and success, but not always. And it was the community aspect and feeling connected, making sense of what was going on. It was such a huge part of why people were gathering and making the music.
But definitely, I think Cecil Morris is a great example of somebody who was, his purpose was for community, essentially. It was just so he was setting up these pirate radio stations all across Birmingham so people from his community could be able to hear their music in a way that they weren't allowed to at that time. With the commercial radio stations, didn't have any shows by Caribbean DJs at all. And his work was an act of resistance in that way, to provide those spaces for their people to reflect on their own community and reflect on their own experiences, but to also they'd pass out funeral details on air and things like that, which help foster that sense of community too. Seeing people go to that length for those community ideals, I think, was really inspiring, really humbling, and a reminder that these are really important things that exist beyond commercial and career gain. There, people really made sacrifices in order for me to even be in a place where I'm writing this book, but for me to even write a book on this music that I love and see the place that it's progressed to, there was a lot of sacrifice that went into it beforehand.
Absolutely. And it's amazing that you've taken the time to write the book and to be able to share those histories, the unsung stories that people don't get to hear about. How much work and how much ambition has gone into making the scene what it is today. Yeah. And the fact that the scenes influence other countries and so many artists globally now. It's a wonderful thing to archive those histories. Yeah. I'd love to know, what does home taste, sound, smell and feel like for you?
I think home for me, the other day my mum had her sister, so my mum came from Cameroon, in the 80s, and her older sister came a bit before that. And her older sister came to my mum's house last week or so, and came with some other relatives who had come from Nigeria. And so just being able to sit there and listen to them talk about their stories about coming to the UK, about being young, and talking about how they managed to foster their own sense of community and home in this space was really powerful, actually. I was just sitting back and listening to them whilst they were all talking over dinner. But then, of course, like the dinner then included loads of food that I tend to typically eat, but I think I've started to take more appreciation for a lot of these foods now, in that the realization that that is what I enjoy the most. Yeah, a lot of Cameroonian and Nigerian dishes specifically. So that's what it tastes like. But I think definitely that sound of just hearing like their specific even blend of accents, which blends kind of British accents because they've been here for so long, but still with pidgin and that kind of thing, and hearing that and being surrounded by that, that is probably where I'm most comfortable. And I've probably only realised it because shortly after they came round, I think the following week, I went to my auntie's house. She lives in North London, and I just went to see her and some of my cousin. And although it's not my house, I felt like the same level of relaxed as if it was in my own house or if it was with my mum. So that really made me realise like what home means to me, and being able to be surrounded by family and community in that way is something that I definitely value more and more as I get older.
And that sense of the diversity of these different communities, because at the very beginning of the book, in the chapter that you read, you really bring to life the migration and the journeys that people have made, and that people wanted to build something nourishing and connective against the odds, against all the adversity and discrimination. The diversity and richness of that was really felt through your writing.
Oh, no, thank you.
What advice would you give to someone who finds themselves unsure of how or where they belong?
Yeah, I think back to the times where I've been unsure about where I belong. And I think there is an element of, I think as you grow into yourself and as you get older, I think it's then important to start putting yourself in spaces where you feel like you belong, and asserting yourself into those spaces too, because that's a lot of times where that sense of, where you're going to find that sense of connection or kinship with other people who you feel like may belong to the kind of communities that you feel like you belong to at the same time too. And I think being part of the creative communities in London, but specifically definitely like the writing spaces in London, and especially a lot of the Black British writing communities in London, I've found such a massive sense of community in that you're automatically getting to connect with people who hold a similar interest in literature, in books, in storytelling, and telling similar stories just in different ways, whether that's fiction or maybe touching on it in different subjects matters. But I found such a huge sense of community and friendship amongst my peers in that sense. But I think that only came from getting to a point where I felt comfortable asserting myself into this space in a way of, that was just in terms of me just writing stuff and putting it out and that kind of thing, but really leaning into who I felt that I was and what my interests were, without necessarily being worried about how that may be perceived and whatnot. There's actually, it reminds me of a chapter in the book about the South Wales Valleys, a guy, Luke, who from a town called Neef Ekpoudom, and it's a really small town on the coast, in between the coast and the valleys. And he was saying, growing up, like Pete, there was quite a traditional way of life. People would grow up, you'd leave school, you'd go to work in the ironworks or the steelworks, you'd play rugby on the weekends, and then you'd do that again. And he had this real interest in music, but felt that he held himself back at times because nobody else in the area was rapping, and it felt it would be almost looked down on and laughed at by his friends, by just the wider community and that. And then he said eventually got to a place where he thought, you know what, I'm just going to do that. I'm just going to essentially be who I am. And having that faith and that boldness, I think, paid off in so many different ways. Not only is he an amazing musician, but he talks about all of the people he's been able to meet along the way who are maybe more aligned with him in terms of his interest in music and culture and storytelling in that way too. And that definitely mirrors my own journey in terms of finding that sense of, friendship and finding friendship. So I would definitely say, don't be afraid to live your interests and to live them loudly and boldly as well.
It's amazing to be seen through creative work as well. I feel like when you're being held in that kind of space, for example, a creative community, and it's a safe one where you can actually rewrite your own story of home belonging.
Yeah.
And through that space, you've been able to give voice to so many people who haven't had their stories platformed, or haven't been able to see the success perhaps, or have their stories heard in different spaces. So what's inspiring you at the moment in terms of creative work, whether that's music or literature?
Yeah, what is inspiring me at the minute? Music wise, I'm listening to, I spent so long listening to rap, for UK rap specifically, on loop. So that's probably still the majority of what I listen to, but I've definitely started listening to a lot more soul music recently. I've been listening to some of the old Sade albums, Solange, rediscovering the Solange albums. I've always been a huge Clear Soul fan, and just hearing that sense of rhythm in a different way, but that sense of vulnerability in the music too, and the way you can talk about these quite abstract concepts with such beauty and with such depth. And that's quite creatively inspiring for me as I start to think about writing again and what I'd like to add to my writing and the direction I'd like to go in with it. That, yeah, depth and real personal sense of honesty, but still layered and laced together in such rhythm and with such a beauty of craft as well. I think that's been a really inspiring but just really amazing thing to listen to at the same time, I would say. And then books wise, I'm reading, again, a lot of my reading focuses on, I always look for rhythm first when I'm reading. So I always look for writers who I feel like there's a sense of rhythm that captivates me and allures me in that way. But I recently read Toni Morrison, Beloved, and that was so interesting in that there isn't, to me anyway, the prose isn't that rhythmic, but the story and her writing is still captivating in that way. And it's still probably the best novel I've ever read, I would say. And that really interested me because she didn't have to rely on prose and rhythm to render these emotions on the page. It was purely a storytelling thing, a craft thing, and how she thinks and sees the world, and how she thinks, or how she thought and saw people, and how people relate to one another. And seeing how she was able to do that definitely opened my mind creatively as well, about thinking beyond rhythm and prose, but how you can add that depth in other ways and that emotion in other ways too.
Gorgeous. And finally, if anybody wants to find out more about you, find out about your work, where can they find you?
Yes, I'm on Instagram and X as Aniefiok EKP. You can find, there will be links to all of my work there. And my website is just my name, Aniefiok Ekpoudom.com. And of course, the book is in all bookstores, independent bookstores as well. So you can definitely grab copies there.
Thank you so much, Aniefiok. It was wonderful to speak to you.
Thank you for having me.
Hi friends, thank you so much for listening to Zeno, a podcast which is all about home, identity and the search for belonging. I'm so grateful to be sharing these conversations with you to help build a more nuanced picture of what belonging means in our world today. Our theme music is by Alex Julian Edwards, and our branding is designed by Somewhere Off Grid. If you want to find out more about our upcoming episodes or receive more resources on crafting your sense of home and belonging, you can subscribe to our newsletter at zenocast.org or follow us on Instagram at @zeno_pod. I'd really appreciate it if you could share our work with other people, share it with friends who you think might resonate with our message, and rate and comment on our podcast on either Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for your generous attention and for listening to our stories.